Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 19 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and it was a long day. Went past 6 p.m. today with 4 witnesses, crucial witnesses from the RCMP testifying, being subjected to cross-examination, and that all took time. The first 2 officers testified in the morning as a joint panel of witnesses, and then there were 2 further officers in the afternoon. In the morning, there was Constables Terry Brown and Dave Melanson, who were involved in the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall shooting. And then in the afternoon, there was Fahie and Corporal Duane Ivany, who were both involved in the Heather O'Brien death, or in assessing Heather O'Brien when she was thought to have been dead, and most likely was, as we heard, I guess, today. These 4 officers had been the subject of, and if you've been following these videos, you would know, have been the subject of many critical questions, and so they were all testifying about their various efforts to stop the active shooter situation. Note off the top that, just to recall, that the union representing the RCMP officers had objected to any officers testifying, but certainly watching the 4 officers today, there were really no signs of that they were traumatized by having to testify. No sign that the experience was terribly difficult for them. I didn't notice any signs of trouble any more so than a regular criminal trial testimony, so I think that was notable. And in fact, I would say that the officers, the later 2 officers at least, probably helped themselves by having the opportunity to explain things out. Things read differently on a page sometimes than they appear coming out of a person's mouth. You get to get a sense of the person's competency, how they answer questions, that sort of thing, just by watching them. Things that you can't sense from a paper, just reading a person's statement, especially given under different circumstances. So start with the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall situation, and if you've been following along, you would know that this is quite a controversial situation. What we know is that Constables Terry Brown and Dave Melanson were driving east would have gone past the fire hall, but coming from the west to the east, stopped about just under 100 meters short of the fire hall, and got out of their vehicle, took shots at the fire hall, at a person that turned out to be an emergency management officer, David Westlake, who had who's wearing a vest, standing by a real RCMP police car. The 2 officers testified and have given statements that they thought perhaps this was the fake car, that they had information that the killer was wearing an orange vest. There was some orange on the vest that we saw in the photos with David Westlake, but it was a yellow vest primarily. And so they thought he was the killer. They took shots at him, were quite certain that they had the right guy. Obviously didn't. Caused some property damage and caused quite a bit of trauma as a result of their actions. And so they were testifying this morning. So they stuck to what they've said so far to other investigators through the CERT investigation, everything else, and didn't diverge from that really. And their account really conflicts with what all of the available evidence from other witnesses, and really what I think any objective observer would consider reasonable under those admittedly unusual circumstances. So other witnesses, so the primary distinction is that these officers, Terry Brown in particular, says that he shouted commands to the person he thought was the killer, and then the person, turned out to be David Westlake, ducked under the car and then ran toward the fire hall door, at which point the officers opened fire. Running towards the fire hall at times, according to witnesses, although they didn't mention that part today. So that conflicts with what other witnesses, including Constable Gagnon, who was a police officer sitting in the police cruiser, David Westlake himself, Jerome Bro, who was driving by, occupants of the neighboring houses. None of them heard any such commands, warnings, anything yelled from the two officers towards the fire hall prior to the shooting. And in fact, it makes actually, in fact, Constable Melanson even could not recall Constable Brown yelling anything either. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, these two testified. They were partners, and I think they were partners for quite a while. They testified together as a joint panel. I think it would have been really interesting to see them testify separately and see what Dave Melanson would have said, because even sitting next to Constable Brown, he said he didn't hear what Constable Brown said. He thought he heard something, but he was focused on the radio. He was trying to get a message through in those very brief moments, and so his focus was elsewhere. So it really, I think, illustrates why witnesses should be questioned individually for the most part. In some cases, maybe it works and they testify together, but I thought that was interesting. If Constable Brown wasn't sitting there, how fulsome would Constable Melanson's answers have been? Maybe more so. And it is worth noting, I think the Constable Melanson only fired one shot. So I thought, the questions were led by Jamie Van Wart from the commission, and once again, as he has before and other commission counsel have, really didn't follow up on what I would have thought would be obvious follow-up questions. Fortunately, we had the cross-examination from Michael Scott from Patterson Law, and Michael Scott asked a really incisive question. I mean, it's the key question, but asked it in a really incisive way. He says, well, now knowing what you know, that it was David Westlake and, he was an EMO officer and all these things, doesn't it seem strange that when, David Westlake hears you yell commands, sees that you are a police officer, you've got the gear on, he's standing next to a police officer, that he would duck and run? Isn't that unusual if what you say is true? And the officers didn't really answer that question, and by doing so, of course, gave an answer by their failure to really answer that question. And I point this out. This is really the power of cross-examination in a way. And sometimes, for people that are familiar with cross-examination on television but not real life, I will tell you that that's about as good as you get from the lawyer's perspective as an answer in cross-examination. It is very rare and almost never the case that a witness breaks down and says, okay, you got me, I admit it, I was lying, so on. The best you can do is really make it obvious to the decision maker or anybody watching that what they're saying just doesn't make any sense, it's not credible, and that's what happened today, and I thought that was really, really well done. The other thing is just the sheer distance, and this was brought up as well in cross-examination. So we saw some photos, quite a ways away from where David Westlake was standing. When they take these shots, they have their carbines, the long rifles, missed widely, thankfully. Well, maybe that's because of the distance. Even though David Melanson was a trainer for carbine training, they were very far away, but they felt 100% confident that it was the killer. Couldn't see his face. Couldn't see that there was a person in the vehicle. Couldn't identify the numbers on the back of the vehicle to determine whether it was the vehicle they were looking for with the particular call sign. And so, really, those things don't all go together. So it was. I thought that was interesting. The other thing that was interesting out of Constable Brown, and he was providing this explanation, I think, as a way to bolster his credibility, but I think most people would see it the other way, which was he described this very singular focus. He talked about auditory exclusion. In other words, he didn't even hear Dave Melanson's shot. He didn't hear other things around him. And his visual focus was totally on the individual, who turned out to be David Westlake. So he didn't see the other cars in the parking lot, didn't see the orange cones around the police car, Didn't see anything else. So, I think he was trying to describe that as a singular focus. I think it was a failure to recognize context and be calm and take a good look. A few other points of interest in that. I noticed Constable Melanson referred to Lisa Banfield by her first name, he called her Lisa at one point. And also he referred to Gabriel Wortman as Gabriel at one point. I thought that was unusual. In my experience, police officers are almost always referring to suspects, witnesses, anybody by their last names, especially when testifying. And so I thought that was notable that he was using first names. No evidence anywhere from what I know that they were familiar with one another, other than he took the statement that morning, the two of them, Brown and Melanson, from Lisa Banfield. Other thing they mentioned was that they were in an unmarked car. And so I think that probably and rightly gave them a bit of an advantage over other officers because, of course, Wortman would be looking out for police vehicles, so the cruisers, and may not be expecting someone in an unmarked car. Now, they knew this, but it may have given them the sense that they were the only ones that might be able to get Wortman. And I wonder if this gave them an over-eagerness to their approach, which may have led to the mistakes they made. That's one possible explanation. The other is, and I think I mentioned this before, which is because they stopped early and they were at a distance and all those things, there's no way they could have seen the situation as well as they should have to open fire, that somebody let them know, either by cell phone, I'm assuming, not over the radio. There's nothing over the radio that would indicate this, but cell phones, they both had cell phones on them. Constable Brown mentioned that he made a phone call afterwards to Staff Sergeant Carroll. So, but nobody seized these phones or analyzed them. Commissioner Stanton did ask whether they made any other phone calls on their phones, and they said no, I think. But nobody's asked about data. Nobody's analyzed them. I'd be very curious if they received any messages on their personal phones to say what was going on at the fire hall before they got there. So that was, I thought, interesting. The other thing was interesting. We got our first objections, sets of objections. The first one, I couldn't really hear who made the objection, but it was all by the federal government lawyer, Department of Justice lawyer Patricia McPhee. There was some earlier objections, but the main one was to a line of questions Michael Scott was going to ask about an internal RCMP investigation into this event. And it was also interesting. So in inquiry law, it's not governed by the same strict rules of evidence as you'd see in a civil trial or a criminal trial. It's supposed to be a little looser so that you get more information and you can make judgments in this context. But Lead Commissioner McDonald ruled in favor of the federal government, sustained the objection, and didn't allow the questions. So I'd be curious about that. Just the very fact that, of course, that she was making those objections shows that there was obviously something to be concealed about that. They didn't want to talk about it, or else they would have just allowed the questions to go through. So that was interesting in itself. So that was the morning. There was lots of other testimony. It was a busy morning with their testimony and lots to discover. So I'm sure people watching were into that testimony. The afternoon was started late because the morning testimony went past 1 o'clock. Although I suspect there were some time limits imposed on Michael Scott. He didn't mention that, but seemed to be the case. He was kind of rushing through at the end, I thought. The afternoon started with Constable Ian Fahie. Constable Fahie was stationed in Antigonish for a while, though I didn't really know him there. I knew he was stationed there, recognized his name. I thought that his testimony, as I was listening to it, was really helping his personal credibility. When I had analyzed his statement before, it seemed like he was in a real frantic state when he was at the Heather O'Brien scene. Said, they have one eye down the road into the woods thinking that there's a boogeyman behind every tree. The way he described it today in person seemed to make it not a calmer situation, but that he was more in control of that scenario. So I thought that probably helped him. Just another example, I guess, of the National Police Federation's mistaken view that no officers should testify. Constable Fahie thought he felt a pulse on Heather O'Brien and had noted that. Now, he testifies that he was quickly relieved by Corporal Duane Ivany, who's a medically trained emergency response officer. Corporal Ivany disputes this. He says he was the first person to treat Heather O'Brien. And there's a real dispute in the evidence on this because Constable Fahie says he opened the driver's side door, checked on Miss O'Brien, heard some sounds emitting from her, maybe involuntary emissions or something, but and thought he felt a pulse, and then was relieved of that duty by Corporal Ivany, and then he was keeping watch to make sure nothing, that the killer wasn't in the area. Okay, but Corporal Ivany says that he was the first on the scene, tried to get in the passenger side, couldn't. His partner, Corporal Constable Mahar, broke the driver's side window, and then they were able to treat Miss O'Brien. So a real dispute there. Says there was no tapping Corporal or Constable Fahie on the shoulder or anything like that. So not sure if a lot turns on that, but it doesn't help. The other things that don't help, Corporal Ivany, the medically trained officer, made a sort of a crucial mistake checking Miss O'Brien's pulse with his thumb, which very basic mistake there. But then he and Corporal Mahar checked her legs, checked her arms, checked pulse in different areas, didn't find anything. Said he checked her eyes as well for movement with the light, and there was no response there as well. So, but this was the reason these two officers were testifying was because of the Fitbit data that we heard that showed that Miss O'Brien's Fitbit was still operating for another 8 hours afterwards. And with the statements that maybe she was alive, the dispute in the evidence, all of these things lead to a lot of speculation and unhelpful speculation. And we heard from Matthew Bowes, chief medical examiner, who said that no, she was deceased, fairly soon. Well, this I think comes back to the trauma-informed mandate of this and just how mixed up this interpretation has become. Nobody wants to talk about any gruesome details in any of this, but in this case, Corporal Ivany mentioned, and it seemed like he accidentally mentioned it during his testimony, that Miss O'Brien was shot in the eye. Okay, well, that would seem to make it fairly clear then that she was probably deceased as a result of that. Well, if you don't say that, and we hear all these other things, the improper taking of the pulse, the dispute of the evidence, well, then it leads to all this other speculation. If you just don't say the plain facts out, as difficult as they may be for the people to hear, I think it's more difficult for the family to endure that speculation. So certainly not trauma-informed in my mind, and I suspect the family feels the same way. But we'll see. A couple of other things of note in the afternoon session. I know the video is getting long, but it was a busy day. The Constable Fahie was driving in his cruiser with his partner. Name escapes me right at the moment, but they were speaking on the way, going through to Burt, going very quickly, and were looking around to see if the killer's vehicle may have been there, if they caught sight of it. And Constable Fahie talks about how they had a discussion, and if he was driving, it was Constable Coleman who was next to him, and the plan was if they see him, Constable Fahie was going to ram the vehicle, Constable Coleman was going to use her carbine and shoot through the windshield and try to take him out. Constable Fahie said they figured they would be injured as a result, but that they needed to do what they needed to do, and that was the plan. Contrast that with the evidence we heard this morning from Constable Brown and Melanson, who know each other quite well and did a lot of things together that day, could not relay any conversations that they had in the car, other than the very brief mention that at one point they thought they had an advantage because they were in an unmarked car. It was the only conversation that they remembered having that day. Just doesn't strike me as credible that on such an occasion those conversations wouldn't sink in a little more. So certainly seemed to me that they were not being totally forthcoming with their evidence. Now, Corporal Ivany spoke at length about his experience, his expertise as a medical officer, made it seem like he was very qualified to make these judgments. But when he makes these mistakes, it doesn't lend a lot of confidence to the situation. So all of that was the afternoon. It stretched into the evening, which is fine. Nothing wrong with having a long day at a hearing. The commission's not back. They're not back tomorrow. I think they're not back till maybe next week. I'll have to check the schedule, check the calendar. So this was a long day for the Mass Casualty Commission, but I think it was an impactful one in terms of witness testimony. And did it ever drive home the importance and the benefit of having witnesses actually testify? So rather than having presentations from commission lawyers, get the witnesses out there, let them testify, be cross-examined, and we will get to the bottom of all of this one way or another. All right, so that was it for day 19. Like I say, an impactful day, a long day, but an important day as well. And so thank you for watching this. I hope you found this enlightening in some ways, and we will see you next time.